I started my cooking journey in the 1920s. The 1920s marked a jumpstart in the processed food industry after new food production methods took off after World War I. Foods like Wonder Bread and Baby Ruth candy bars became prevalent everywhere. I made Hoover Stew, which was a popular soup kitchen staple during the time of the Great Depression, where 1 out of 4 Americans were jobless. The stew was made of macaroni elbows combined with hot dogs, corn, and tomatoes. Here's my process in making Hoover Stew. First, I decided to cut up all the hot dogs and I poured the pasta in the boiling water. Then, in a separate pan, I combined the rest of the ingredients: tomatoes, hot dogs, frozen corn. I then strained the cooked pasta, and interestingly enough, you keep the extra strained pasta water to use for the stew later. Here's what the ingredients look like after a bit of simmering. 20 minutes on simmer later, my stew was ready. I decided to take a taste test and eat some of it before I had practice in a couple hours. It was great carbo loading. Moving into the 1930s and 40s, I made chocolate chip cookies. Chocolate chip cookies are an American classic, and their recipe has not changed much since their invention. Chocolate chip cookies were invented in 1938 by Ruth Wakefield, who ran the popular Toll House restaurant in Whitman, Massachusetts, with her husband. The exact method of how they were invented is under speculation, but apparently it is because Wakefield ran out of other cookie ingredients and decided to improvise. The famous restaurant had a cookbook where they included their new cookie recipe. It was an immediate hit and even captured the attention of Betty Crocker. In 1939, Wakefield gave Nestle the right to use her cookie recipe and Toll House name, which you will see on the bag of chocolate chips which I use. Her business skills obviously didn't match her baking skills, as she gave up both these things for $1. Here's me making the cookies and using the Toll House chips. After putting them into the oven with my mom, I then sat for 10 minutes and waited. Unfortunately, they came out a little misshapen, but nonetheless, they were delicious.
Hot. Okay.
That's gonna be hot.
Oh, it's delicious. It's so good. Wow. You've outdone yourself. Very, very good.
As we moved through the decades, I then decided to replicate a TV dinner. My dad grew up eating Swanson's, and I tried to model it after that. In the 1950s, TVs were a new and fascinating phenomenon that were especially captivating for kids. The 3 to 4 hours of new programming per day usually happened in the late afternoon or evening, and it became very common for families to eat together in front of the TV. TV dinners also gave women, who usually had their days consumed with cooking, time to pursue jobs and other interests while still being able to serve a hot meal to their families. Here's me making Salisbury steak, canned veggies, and mashed potatoes. The Salisbury steak took a lot more work than I realized, and it was a combination of many different types of sauces. Also, cooking it for a while took a while because then again I had to put it on simmer for a long time. The canned veggies though were relatively easy. Once it was done, I realized it did not look so appetizing. But after eating it, I did realize it was pretty good. I then decided to add some mashed potatoes. This is the final result of my plate. Pretty realistic, don't you think? Fondue gained its popularity during the 60s. The 60s was a turbulent decade, marked by the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and anti war protests. Fondue hails from Switzerland and was made popular in the US by a chef named Conrad Engeli, who was a chef and eventual owner of a restaurant called Charlotte Suisse in New York. As fondue took off, people started to experiment with chocolate fondue, with pieces of fruit being dipped in. Eating fondue in the 60s definitely made you cool and was an awesome way to show off to your date. I ended up finding an old fondue pot and making cheese fondue. I used different types of cheddar cheese and a little bit of Swiss cheese. It was relatively easy to make, and afterwards I cut up bread to be dipped in it. Let's see what my sister's boyfriend had to say about it.
It's like liquid grilled cheese. So good.
The 1980s was a decade full of many twists and turns, starting with the Iran hostage crisis and ending with the symbolic fall of communism with the Berlin Wall. With the election of Ronald Reagan became a rise in conservatism and a favor of preserving traditional American values. Also, a group of Americans called yuppies arose, who always had to dress for success. Sloppy Joes were popular in the US during the 80s, and they were invented when a cook at a small town cafe in Iowa added tomato sauce to his loose meat sandwiches. Making sloppy joes was not quite as simple as I thought. It involved tons of ingredients, and I had never really cooked meat before. Here's a video of me trying. I soon combined Worcester sauce, tomato paste, brown sugar, mustard, ketchup, vegetables, and even more to make my sloppy joes. Let's see my dad and my sister's boyfriend's reaction.
Hey, I remember this from my childhood. It's fantastic.
You've done it again. It's delicious. It's really good.
Jello Pops, or pudding pops, were my last and final dish. In the 80s, many fun phrases we still use today originated, such as ASAP, or as soon as possible, or cut to the chase. People were starting to communicate a sense of urgency, as that many sought money in lives that flaunted it. Pudding Pops were first marketed by the company Jell-O, and Bill Cosby served as their spokesperson. They originated in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and they were extremely popular from the 1970s to the 1990s, but then they were then discontinued after not being profitable. After being absent for a while, they were reintroduced to grocery stores under the Popsicle brand name. I decided to make my own take on Jello Pops and made Funfetti Jello Pops. I used vanilla instant Jello pudding, traditional to the pudding pop recipe, but also added sprinkles. Let's see how they turned out. I thought they were really good. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope you learned something.